Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name is Lee. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Information Sciences, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My session title is From Plan to Practice, Interorganizational Response Networks Based on Emergency Management Plans, Situational Reports, and Tweets about 4 major hurricane events. So I've started recording. The founding partner, and thank you, School of Information at San Jose State University for sponsoring this wonderful event. It's actually my first time attending, and I'm excited for the next few years to keep attending. Great. For acknowledgement, I'd like to thank my grant funders from the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute at the Department of Homeland Security for this research, and my collaborator is the United States Coast Guard for this particular project. As quick speaker bio, so I am a job market and in the School of Information Sciences here at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. My research is on computational social science methods for crisis informatics. And so actually this is a very suitable topic, I think, for this conference. I just attended an earlier talk with folks, I think, from Tennessee State University. We're talking about local government resources for crisis. And it was so great to see many of the resources that they talk about are at the federal level. And I will be discussing in great length in terms of interorganizational collaboration for crisis response. Great, so problem statement. As we all know, either as librarians or information scientists, or the public, we know that emergency response is a very complex, large-scale socio-technical system. In my definition, the system comprises of 2 types of dynamic collaborations between agencies. If we wanted to see through what this kind of network and what kind of system is like, we have 2 main kinds, actually. So the first one would be prescribed or institutionalized networks. This is based on a pretty well-known theory by Dinh in 1970. And this is institutionalized networks. So what should be happening? The ideal image of what response looked like. And this is based on, national response framework. This tends to be revised pretty frequently every few years. And this is outlined by the Department of Homeland Security, more specifically the FEMA, or Federal Emergency Management Agency. And then you have these very interesting things, grassroots emergent types of networks, which I call observed response networks. So what actually happened? What did people do in the response to a disaster? And that can be extracted in many ways. So either you as a first responder see it from your own point of view, right? As a local emergency response officer, for example, people on scene. And in my argument, in my paper, I've discussed that situational reports or text level indicators of what a response looked like. Of course, this is still unstructured text data, so it requires a lot of processing, which I will discuss in a minute as well. And to be able to understand the complex dynamics of emergency response, I precisely look at these 2 things. I look at the levels of congruence and incongruence in the network structure. And what does it tell us? First of all, it tells us, did response look like what it should be like? Right, so that's touching upon implications for policy and specifically for response policy. Is this facilitating effective organizational collaboration with folks, at the federal level, at the state, and at the local level? If not, do there need to be updates to make sure that there are structures and collaborations in place to ensure more effective response preparation and, emergency preparation or emergency response? So the specific research question follows what I've just outlined in the problem statement. So first of all, it's a very kind of structural based question of how do extracted networks compare to the actual prescribed networks? And secondly, what can we learn from these differences? And difference can be defined in many ways between the extracted versus the prescribed network. So again, the prescribed networks here, in my operationalization, I look specifically at national response guidelines at 3 different levels. As we all know, that response don't just happen at one level, right? So usually it starts at the federal level, at the state level, and then at the local level. But if I may quote some of my first responder friends and people who have been actively involved in research, they say response always starts at the local level. But then we had to go, there's this, constant systemic systems level renegotiation of top-down versus bottom-up response structures. And so this is why it's so interesting to look at the structures in place for these. Again, the interaction networks are structured from text data, and I'll talk about it in a minute, what kind of text they are. And then assessment to look at the areas of similarities, like to see what the mandates suggest, what the government response look like, and what actually happened match. Okay, great. So what was institutionalized actually was put into action. Fantastic. But there are also cases, what I call opportunities or false positive in a structural point of view, meaning that collaborations that actually took place but didn't show up in the institutionalized structures, then maybe there are ways that the policies can be updated to facilitate these connections. Right? There are also needs, so areas where institutions suggest that, let's say, these two organizations should work together, but we seldom see them work together. Perhaps there could be amendments for that as well. Right, so in terms of data and method, the prescribed network, as I said, is from 3 different levels of government, federal, state, and local responses. And the observed network, I'm focusing on situational reports, which I think is able to capture basically the daily updates of what happened in a response in a pretty systematic manner, and usually with very formalized language. Whereas for social media, while there's a huge amount of them, the structure of the text itself is not as formalized, so requires much more text pre-processing. And I took it through a standardized text pre-processing approach using a state-of-the-art text processing packages to be able to do that, which includes tokenization, chunking, syntactic tagging to tag the words into their various syntax, and also negation handling. So negation handling, I think, is specifically important as a pre-processing step for social media data, because let's say they say these two organizations are not working together. It's very important to establish that not is an indicator of negation, meaning there are actually no connection between the two organizations, as opposed to there is a connection. Network extraction, this is where I think the methodological development of my work is, but it's to establish in a semi-automated manner the types of nodes and edges that exist in this network. So if you see a piece of text here, like UNDAC and the World Food Program conducted a joint rapid assessment, you would see these two entities are being picked up, and there would have been an edge between them, suggesting that they work together on something. That something would have been a joint rapid assessment. And last but not least, a comparison, which is where the fun part, and I'll show you a lot of networks on that. Great. And the kind of data, I think you must have been asking, Lee, what kind of disasters are you studying? In my case, I'm studying 4 major US-based hurricanes that actually made landfall in the US in different locations. So you may ask, why just the US? Well, for the prescribed network specifically, they are meant to be national guidelines. So focusing just on the boundary specification problem, just focusing in on the US would make valid sense here. And these 4 major hurricane events, all of category 4, received wild national attention. A lot of organizations that work together to minimize the adverse impacts of them. So I think most of you have known about these 4 major events: Matthew, Harvey, Irma, and Michael. And they made landfall in different areas, which also allowed us to see what response were like at the different areas across the US. I think except for Irma and Michael, which were both in Florida, it's also another very interesting story to tell, with the same categories, same state, but different local jurisdiction. And for the data sample, as you can already see, just looking at the numbers, Twitters seem like much bigger. Situation reports are much less, but actually in terms of the actual number of word counts, they're relatively comparable. Because as I shared before, sitreps are pretty formalized language and in pages length, as opposed to Twitter was only 140 characters per tweet. For time frame of situation reports and Twitter, you may see some differences here, but if I may share, the specific time frame that was set for every event was 2 weeks before until 2 weeks after the hurricane made landfall. So hurricane is one of those interesting things, is that we actually know it ahead, right? And we know that we can plan for it. So actually looking at it before the actual landfall to see what kind of preparedness that dynamics were like were pretty interesting. So for Twitter, we can see that indeed that wide coverage of tweets that actually were relevant and about the hurricane. And people may have talked about it kind of tangentially related, but tags about the hurricanes were used. But for situational reports, though, they only were released when there were actually some kind of actions that have taken place. Great. For prescribed network construction, for the federal level, as I've shared, we use one entire framework that should represent the entire kind of federal level response, what it looked like. Whereas for the state, it's very unique to each state. Each state has their own emergency operations plan, and I've made sure that the emergency management plan that I use were the version of that year or the year before that, just so that the management plan, there weren't any major changes, right? If we were to use the most recent one, that may have looked very different from the plan that was used in response to Harvey, for example. For the local level response networks, I was thankful to be able to actually talk to emergency operation managers and officers of specifically of Aransas County, Texas, and Bay County, Florida, to be able to get these emergency operation plans of that time, of the time when the plan was used to respond to that particular hurricane. So it was fantastic to be able to see what the ideal image of what response looked like for those at the 3 different levels. For the observed networks, name entity recognition is a big task, and this is one of the hardest tasks, in my opinion, to be able to recognize its entities, right? If we see in a huge chunk of messy text, can we identify FEMA as a meaningful entity? So instead of using one NER tool, as most of the studies do, I've actually looked at the intersection of both of these tools, state-of-the-art SPACY and FLAIR NLP, to identify the meaningful entities in terms of, GP or geopolitical entities, organizations or national religious political groups or NORPs, and the persons or locations. So they're mutually exclusive categories. And for the relation extraction, there are 3 different kinds of connections that I allow in the network. So first of all, they can just be 2 organizations or 2 entities can be connected if they are adjacent to each other. So this allows us to capture those kinds of sentence structures like, hey, these following organizations have worked together and act in response to Hurricane Michael, for example, UN, DAC, WFP, DOD, right? So this would have been captured as connections between each other. For constituency-based network, this is also really interesting, where 2 entities are based on some kind of parts of speech in between them. So you can have things like BBC News in London, or you can have UNDAC and World Food Program. For dependency-based network, it allows us to also look at the shortest dependency path in between them. So for example, here's the parse tree of the same sentence from BBC News in London. The shortest path from these 2 nouns here, BBC News and London, is, let's say, 1, 2, for example. So these are the kinds of relationships that are allowed in the networks. We'll show you some cool networks in a minute. All right, and the quick experimental design is, again, I'm looking at response prescribed networks at 3 different levels, and then compare that to the observed networks based on 2 different types of text data. That allows us to establish connections of what actually happened during the response, right? And the fun thing about prescribed network, now I think some of the folks here have covered federal response, right? We see many discussions of FEMA and governmental guidelines for response. Emergency support functions is a big thing in incident management response, and I've created these kind of conceptualizations to be able to capture what response look like at the federal level between different organizations. You can see briefly from the network visualization that they are so all connected, right? And that's a very idealized image of federal response where, great, everything is supposed to be everyone is supposed to be working together. All right, now let's look at the state level. State level doesn't always look like the federal level. where each state has its own different mandates, right? For Florida, if I may share first, the edge colors are defined by a specific clustering. There aren't any predefined groups per se. I mean, they are grouped by the different emergency support functions, but they're much more flexible at the state level. But these are actually defined by Louvain modularity, one of the network modularity measures. You can briefly see, right? Let's say Florida, South Carolina. I guess you can see 5 to 7 emergent major groups. For Texas, though, you can see 2 emergent groups. So there are different structural differences that kind of hints to us what are the institutional norms for what an ideal response look like. In a federal, it looked very egalitarian. Everyone, there isn't a hierarchy, not per se. And then for Florida and South Carolina, it seems like there's some kind of hierarchy, right? You have organizations that actually play very important as middle persons to different groups. There are also organizations that stood out to be highly central, so actually highly known as leaders of that particular cluster, for example. Whereas here in Texas, it seems like everyone's well connected to each other and there are only 2 clusters. So even if just comparing the prescribed networks themselves within the different levels from federal to state, you already see a difference. Let's look at the local level. And we haven't even to the observed levels yet. Just at the prescribed network, we already see fundamental structural differences. Now, briefly, looking at the different counties looking at different counties, and I apologize, I think I have a spelling mistake here. This is actually meant to be Monroe County. I'm sorry, Monroe County in Florida. That was Hurricane Irma, whereas this is Charleston County for Hurricane Matthew. But you can briefly also see similar structures here, like what we discussed before. For Aransas County, for example, looks like there are only 2 clusters. People are working together so well. There isn't really one group of organization that stood up as a leader, right? But for other local response jurisdiction, you see a hierarchy, definitely, with different clusters suitable for the different kinds of emergency support functions. Let's look at the observed network. This table is not meant to be scary, and I hope to be able to supply you in a minute with visual aids for that. But the main story to say is that we do have this kind of complex cross-group comparison to be able to get at the types of the number of overlap between the organizations seen at the observed network and seen at the prescribed network, if there is. Let's dig right in. Let's look at Hurricane Matthew. So the coloring scheme is hope it doesn't upset your eyes. So at the green is federal level. What that means is the organizations overlapped that was shown up in the observed network was also in the prescribed network. So let's say the connection between Department of Commerce and FEMA were really frequent and active in the federal response. That was also shown indeed in the observed network based on the situational reports. Now that's a great thing. Okay, these organizations are meant to be together, to work together, and they did, right? But then look at the other kinds of overlap. Not so much, right? You see local level is virtually none, maybe tiny bit here. And at the state level, not so much. But what you see is a huge blobs of gray in general. What that means is non-overlap. So this is what I'm talking about with the importance of the opportunities. There are many fantastic organizations. And just for the visual aid, I couldn't show the labels for all the organizations, but there are many very powerful organizations that are non-US, that are non-governmental based, like I show here, United States Agency for International Development. That was involved, but weren't shown in any of the prescribed or institutionalized norms for response. So these are opportunities for policies to maybe be more inclusive of collaborations. And same for tweets-based, though as you can see here, tweets honestly is the hard part where to clean up a lot of organizations that weren't relevant at all to the response. So this is very important, but those organizations that were important made it here. But we saw a lot of federal connections as well and some state in the tweet space, which is so interesting. And tweets actually include folks who are also emergency response planners or news agency, local news agencies, state level agencies, and federal as well. So this is also interesting to tell with tweets being a useful social sensor for crisis response. Let's say for Irma, similar story. wow, it's a lot of gray, right? As you can see, so a lot of non-overlaps, but those with overlaps tend to be federal organizations that are major, like in FEMA, showed up a lot in the tweets. In SITREPS, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was so involved for Hurricane Irma specifically. It was so interesting. For local though, this is interesting for Irma because a lot of electric company like Keys Energy Services here or the Florida Power and Light were very heavily mentioned and heavily involved with other organizations to be able to ensure to get power back up, for example. For Hurricane Harvey, now this looks a little bit different from what we saw before, right? So we saw more state level involvement. Wow, Texas Department of Public Safety, Texas Division of Emergency Management were heavily mentioned with a lot of involvement with other organizations. So this is kind of action we want to see at the state level, taking charge. And the same for federal, a lot of federal overlap as well. And Department of Interior was highly involved. Not so much at the local level though. But another story, Hurricane Michael was another story. The involvement of local response organization was so active for Hurricane Michael. That was just too fantastic to include Hurricane Michael in here. City of Panama and Mexico Beach were very involved with, local response, grassroots response. And this is where it's heartwarming to see local level response being so active. But still, we do see a prominent number of non-overlaps or opportunities for policies to include non-governmental, non-profit organizations who actually played a huge role in response. But overall, I think you've all also made your own conclusions. I would love to hear your thoughts and any suggestions for the work, but mainly instead of the theoretical framework, right? Institutionalized norms for crisis response and emergent coordination are fundamentally different. So great, this would actually empirically validate the theories that came before it. That's great. Institutionalized response frameworks, as we all, I think, conjecture, it's an idealized structure. Highly connected, people are human, there is still hierarchy in place, but people are overall expected to work all together. And it does vary at different levels of response. So federal, state, local, all of different. Emergent response network, however, looks different. It's much bigger with lower overlaps, more sparse, but also many entities that were not mentioned, but also helpful for response. So the main point that I take from this is actually if we look at the levels of overlap being indicators of, what was meant to happen did happen in response, then there were more institutionalized links at the federal level seen in the emergent networks, right? So federal level were frequently mentioned. I think FEMA always came across the minds of people, and also Department of the Interior were involved, and other federal organizations, but not so much as we see in overall for state or local level. And I think that says something about, policy making decisions, perhaps looking at the current plans or incident management plans, perhaps they're more friendly for federal organizations or for federal decision making. But when it comes to actually the communities that matter, like local response, what is the coordination structure like between local, state, and federal? Is it currently still being facilitated based on its policies, or can it be advanced better? But at least what I can say, looking at a structural point of view with a policy flavor, that I think perhaps more could be done. So that's really the main points that I have in the presentation. I would now open up the floor and would really welcome your thoughts and opinions on this work. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. I just saw your comment. Oh no, I'm so sorry to hear about that. Yeah, Hurricane Ida, definitely. That hurricane response is also a very complex matter, though we know to prepare for it, the level of preparedness does vary as well. And thank you, Kristen, as well. Yeah, if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I think the recording will be online and the slides will be available, I believe. If you have any questions, please let me know. Well, thanks. Yeah, one of the things that since we are in library point 2.021, honestly, libraries are a major part of response at the local level, which was so great. And I think, yeah, it's a lot to take in. Yes. Sorry about that. But it's a structural take on the discussion that basically hurricane response requires so much coordination at multiple levels of the government and non-government. But yes, thank you. I think I can stop the recording now.